Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly, by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Volume 1, Chapter 1, in which the reader is introduced to a man of humanity. Late in the afternoon of a chilly day in February, two gentlemen were sitting alone over their wine, in a well-furnished dining parlor, in the town of P in Kentucky. There were no servants present, and the gentlemen, with chairs closely approaching, seemed to be discussing some subject with great earnestness. For convenience sake, we have said, hitherto, two gentlemen. One of the parties, however, when critically examined, did not seem, strictly speaking, to come under the species. He was a short, thick-set man, with coarse, commonplace features, and that swaggering air of pretension which marks a low man who is trying to elbow his way upward in the world. He was much overdressed, in a gaudy vest of many colors, a blue neckerchief, bedropped gaily with yellow spots, and arranged with a flaunting tie, quite in keeping with the general air of the man. His hands, large and coarse, were plentifully bedecked with rings, and he wore a heavy gold watch chain, with a bundle of seals of portentous size, and a great variety of colors, attached to it, which, in the ardor of conversation, he was in the habit of flourishing and jingling with evident satisfaction. His conversation was in free and easy defiance of Murray's grammar, and was garnished at convenient intervals with various profane expressions, which not even the desire to be graphic in our account shall induce us to transcribe. His companion, Mr. Shelby, had the appearance of a gentleman, and the arrangements of the house, and the general air of the housekeeping, indicated easy, and even opulent circumstances. As we before stated, the two were in the midst of an earnest conversation. "That is the way I should arrange the matter," said Mr. Shelby. "I can't make trade that way, I positively can't." "Mr. Shelby," said the other, holding up a glass of wine between his eye and the light. "Why, the fact is, Haley, Tom is an uncommon fellow. He is certainly worth that sum anywhere. Steady, honest, capable, manages my whole farm like a clock." "You mean honest, as niggers go," said Haley, helping himself to a glass of brandy. "No, I mean, really, Tom is a good, steady, sensible, pious fellow. He got religion at a camp meeting 4 years ago, and I believe he really did get it. I've trusted him since then, with everything I have, money, house, horses, and let him come and go round the country, and I always found him true and square in everything." "Some folks don't believe they're as pious niggers, Shelby," said Haley, with a candid flourish of his hand. "But I do. I had a fellow, now, in this last lot I took to Orleans, tea was as good as a meetin' now. Really, to hear that critter pray, and he was quite gentle and quiet like. He fetched me a good sum, too, for I bought him cheap of a man that was ligged to sell out, so I realized 600 on him. Yes, I consider religion a valuable thing in a nigger, when it's the genuine article, and no mistake." "Well, Tom's got the real article, if ever a fellow had," rejoined the other. "Why, last fall, I let him go to Cincinnati alone, to do business for me, and bring home $500. Tom, says I to him, I trust you, because I think you're a Christian, I know you wouldn't cheat. Tom comes back, sure enough, I knew you would. Some low fellows, they say, said to him, 'Tom, why don't you make tracks for Canada?' Ah, master trusted me, and I couldn't, they told me about it. I am sorry to part with Tom. I must say, you ought to let him cover the whole balance of the debt, and you would. Haley, if you had any conscience." "Well, I've got just as much conscience as any man in business can afford to keep, just a little. You know, to swear by, as 't were," said the trader, jocularly, and then, "I'm ready to do anything in reason to oblige friends, but this you see, is a leetle too hard on a fellow, a leetle too hard." The trader sighed contemplatively, and poured out some more brandy. "Well, then, Haley, how will you trade?" said Mr. Shelby, after an uneasy interval of silence. "Well, haven't you a boy or gal that you could throw in with Tom?" None that I could well spare, to tell the truth. It's only hard necessity makes me willing to sell it all. I don't like parting with any of my hands. That's a fact." Here the door opened, and a small quadroon boy, between 4 and 5 years of age, entered the room, There was something in his appearance remarkably beautiful and engaging. His black hair, fine as floss silk, hung in glossy curls about his round, dimpled face, while a pair of large dark eyes, full of fire and softness, looked out from beneath the rich, long lashes, as he peered curiously into the apartment. A gay robe of scarlet and yellow plaid, carefully made and neatly fitted, set off to advantage the dark and rich style of his beauty, and a certain comic air of assurance, blended with bashfulness, showed that he had been not unused to being petted and noticed by his master. "Helloa, Jim Crow," said Mr. Shelby, whistling, and snapping a bunch of raisins towards him. "Pick that up, now." The child scampered, with all his little strength, after the prize, while his master laughed. "Come here, Jim Crow," said he. The child came up, and the master patted the curly head, and chucked him under the chin. "Now, Jim, show this gentleman how you can dance and sing." The boy commenced one of those wild, grotesque songs common among the Negroes, in a rich, clear voice, accompanying his singing with many comic evolutions of the hands, feet, and whole body, all in perfect time to the music. "Bravo," said Haley, throwing him a quarter of an orange. "Now, Jim, walk like old Uncle Cujo, when he has the rheumatism," said his master. Instantly the flexible limbs of the child assumed the appearance of deformity and distortion, as, with his back humped up, and his master's stick in his hand, he hobbled about the room, his childish face drawn into a doleful pucker, and spitting from right to left, in imitation of an old man. Both gentlemen laughed uproariously. "Now, Jim," said his master, "show us how old Elder Robbins leads the psalm." The boy drew his chubby face down to a formidable length, and commenced toning a psalm tune through his nose, with imperturbable gravity. "Hurrah, bravo, what a young said Haley, "that chap's a case. I'll promise. Tell you what," said he, suddenly clapping his hand on Mr. Shelby's shoulder, "fling in that chap, and I'll settle the business, I will. Come, now, if that ain't doing the thing up about the rightest." At this moment, the door was pushed gently open, and a young quadroon woman, apparently about 25, entered the room. There needed only a glance from the child to her, to identify her as its mother. There was the same rich, full, dark eye, with its long lashes, the same ripples of silky black hair. The brown of her complexion gave way on the cheek to a perceptible flush, which deepened as she saw the gaze of the strange man fixed upon her in bold and undisguised admiration. Her dress was of the neatest possible fit, and set off to advantage her finely molded shape. A delicately formed hand and a trim foot and ankle were items of appearance that did not escape the quick eye of the trader, well used to run up at a glance the points of a fine female article. "Well, Eliza," said her master, as she stopped and looked hesitatingly at him. "I was looking for Harry." "Please, sir," and the boy bounded toward her, showing his spoils, which he had gathered in the skirt of his robe. "Well, take him away, then," said Mr. Shelby, and hastily she withdrew, carrying the child on her arm. "By Jupiter," said the trader, turning to him in admiration, "there's an article. Now, you might make your fortune on that AR gal in Orleans. Any day. I've seen over 1,000, in my day, paid down for gals not a bit handsomer. I don't want to make my fortune on her," said Mr. Shelby, dryly, and, seeking to turn the conversation, he uncorked a bottle of fresh wine, and asked his companion's opinion of it. "Capital, sir, first chop," said the trader, then turning, and slapping his hand familiarly on Shelby's shoulder, he added, "Come, how will you trade about the gal? What shall I say for her? What'll you take?" "Mr. Haley, she is not to be sold," said Shelby. "My wife would not part with her for her weight in gold." Aye, women always say such things, 'cause they haunt no sort of calculation. Just show 'em how many watches, feathers, and trinkets one's weight in gold would buy, and that alters the case. I reckon. I tell you, Haley, this must not be spoken of. I say no and I mean no," said Shelby, decidedly. "Well, you'll let me have the boy, though," said the trader. "You must own have come down pretty handsomely for him." "What on earth can you want with the child?" said Shelby. "Why, I've got a friend that's going into this branch of the business. Wants to buy up handsome boys to raise for the market. Fancy articles entirely, sell for waiters. And so on. To rich uns that can pay for handsome uns. It sets off one of great places, a real handsome boy to open door. Wait, and tend. They fetch a good sum, and this little devil is such a comical. Musical concern, he's just the article. I would rather not sell him, said Mr. Shelby, thoughtfully. The fact is, sir, I'm a humane man, and I hate to take the boy from his mother. Sir. Oh, you do? Yes. Something of that nature? I understand. Perfectly. It is mighty unpleasant getting on with women. Sometimes, I always hates these screamin' times. They are mighty unpleasant, but, as I manages business, I generally avoids 'em, sir. Now, what if you get the girl off for a day, or a week, or so, then the thing's done quietly, all over before she comes home. Your wife might get her some earrings, or a new gown, or some such truck, to make up with her. I'm afraid not. Lor bless ye, yes, these critters ain't like white folks. You know, they gets over things. Only manage right. Now, they say, said Haley, assuming a candid and confidential air, that this kind o' trade is hardening to the feelings, but I never found it so. Fact is, I never could do things up the way some fellers manage the business. I've seen him as would pull a woman's child out of her arms and set him up to sell. And she's screechin' like mad all the time. Very bad policy, damages the article, makes 'em quite unfit for service sometimes. I knew a real handsome gal once, in Orleans, as was entirely ruined by this sort o' handling. The fellow that was trading for her didn't want her baby, and she was one of your real high sort. When her blood was up, I tell you, she squeezed up her child in her arms, and talked, and went on real awful. It kinder makes my blood run cold to think on't, and when they carried off the child and locked her up, she just went ravin' mad, and died in a week. Clear waste, sir, of $1,000. Just for want of management. There's where tea is. It's always best to do the humane thing. Sir, that's been my experience. And the trader leaned back in his chair, and folded his arms, with an air of virtuous decision, apparently considering himself a second Wilberforce. The subject appeared to interest the gentleman deeply, for while Mr. Shelby was thoughtfully peeling an orange, Haley broke out afresh, with becoming diffidence, but as if actually driven by the force of truth to say a few words more. It don't look well, now, for a feller to be praisin' himself, but I say it just because it's the truth. I believe I'm reckoned to bring in about the finest droves of niggers that is brought in, at least. I've been told so, if I have once. I reckon I have 100 times, all in good case, fat and likely. And I lose as few as any man in the business. And I lays it all to my management. Sir, and humanity, sir, I may say, is the great pillar of my management. Mr. Shelby did not know what to say. And so he said, indeed, now, I've been laughed at for my notions, sir, and I've been talked to. They ain't poplar, and they ain't common, but I stuck to 'em. Sir, I've stuck to 'em. And realized well on 'em, yes. Sir, they have paid their passage, I may say, and the trader laughed at his joke. There was something so piquant and original in these elucidations of humanity, that Mr. Shelby could not help laughing in company. Perhaps you laugh too, dear reader, but you know humanity comes out in a variety of strange forms nowadays. And there is no end to the odd things that humane people will say and do. Mr. Shelby's laugh encouraged the trader to proceed. It's strange, now, but I never could beat this into people's heads. Now, there was Tom Loker, my old partner, down in Natchez. He was a clever fellow. Tom was, only the very devil with niggers, on principle, T was. You see, for a better-hearted feller never broke bread, T was his system. Sir, I used to talk to Tom. Why, Tom, I used to say, when your gals takes on and cry, what's the use o' crackin' on 'em over the head, and knockin' on 'em round? It's ridiculous, says I, and don't do no sort o' good. Why, I don't see no harm in their cryin', says I, it's nature, says I, and if nature can't blow off one way, it will another. Besides, Tom, says I, it just spiles your gals, they get sickly. And down in the mouth, and sometimes they gets ugly. Particular yallow gals do. and it's the devil and all gettin' on him broke in. Now, says I, why can't you kinder coax him up and speak 'em fair? Depend on it, Tom, a little humanity, thrown in along, goes a heap further than all your jawin' and crackin', and it pays better, says I, depend on, T. But Tom couldn't get the hang on, T, and he spiled so many for me that I had to break off with him, though he was a good-hearted fellow, and as fair a business hand as is goin'. And do you find your ways of managing do the business better than Tom's? Said Mr. Shelby. Why, yes, sir, I may say so. You see, when I anyways can, I takes a leetle care about the unpleasant parts, like selling young uns and that. Get the gals out of the way, out of sight, out of mind, you know, and when it's clean done, and can't be helped, they naturally gets used to it. Tant, you know, as if it was white folks that's brought up in the way of spectin' to keep their children and wives. And all that. Niggers, you know, that's fetched up properly. Ha'n't no kind of expectations of no kind, so all these things comes easier. I'm afraid mine are not properly brought up. Then, said Mr. Shelby, suppose not, you Kentucky folks spile your niggers. You mean well by 'em, but 'tan't no real kindness. Arter all. Now, a nigger, you see, what's got to be hacked and tumbled round the world, and sold to Tom, and Dick, and the Lord knows who. 'Tan't no kindness to be given on him notions and expectations, and bringin' on him up too well, for the rough and tumble comes all the harder on him arter. Now, I venture to say, your niggers would be quite chop fallen in a place where some of your plantation niggers would be singing and whooping like all possessed. Every man, you know, Mr. Shelby, naturally thinks well of his own ways, and I think I treat niggers just about as well as it's ever worthwhile to treat 'em. It's a happy thing to be satisfied, said Mr. Shelby, with a slight shrug, and some perceptible feelings of a disagreeable nature. Well, said Haley, after they had both silently picked their nuts for a season, what do you say? I'll think the matter over, and talk with my wife, said Mr. Shelby. Meantime, Haley, if you want the matter carried on in the quiet way you speak of, you'd best not let your business in this neighborhood be known. It will get out among my boys, and it will not be a particularly quiet business getting away any of my fellows. If they know it, I'll promise you. Oh, certainly, by all means. Mum, of course, but I'll tell you, I'm in a devil of a hurry, and shall want to know, as soon as possible, what I may depend on, said he, rising and putting on his overcoat. Well, call up this evening, between 6 and 7, and you shall have my answer, said Mr. Shelby, and the trader bowed himself out of the apartment. I'd like to have been able to kick the fellow down the steps, said he to himself, as he saw the door fairly closed, with his impudent assurance, but he knows how much he has me at advantage. If anybody had ever said to me that I should sell Tom down south to one of those rascally traders, I should have said, is thy servant a dog, that he should do this thing? And now it must come, for aught I see, and Eliza's child, too. I know that I shall have some fuss with wife about that, and, for that matter, about Tom, too. So much for being in debt, hi-oh. The fellow sees his advantage, and means to push it. Perhaps the mildest form of the system of slavery is to be seen in the state of Kentucky. The general prevalence of agricultural pursuits of a quiet and gradual nature, not requiring those periodic seasons of hurry and pressure that are called for in the business of more southern districts, makes the task of the Negro a more healthful and reasonable one, while the master, content with a more gradual style of acquisition, has not those temptations to hard-heartedness which always overcome frail human nature when the prospect of sudden and rapid gain is weighed in the balance, with no heavier counterpoise than the interests of the helpless and unprotected. Whoever visits some estates there, and witnesses the good-humored indulgence of some masters and mistresses, and the affectionate loyalty of some slaves, might be tempted to dream the oft-fabled poetic legend of a patriarchal institution. And all that, but over and above the scene there broods a portentous shadow, the shadow of law. So long as the law considers all these human beings, with beating hearts and living affections, only as so many things belonging to a master, so long as the failure, or misfortune, or imprudence, or death of the kindest owner, may cause them any day to exchange a life of kind protection and indulgence for one of hopeless misery and toil. So long it is impossible to make anything beautiful or desirable in the best regulated administration of slavery. Mr. Shelby was a fair average kind of man, good-natured and kindly, and disposed to easy indulgence of those around him, and there had never been a lack of anything which might contribute to the physical comfort of the Negroes on his estate. He had, however, speculated largely and quite loosely, had involved himself deeply, and his notes to a large amount had come into the hands of Haley, and this small piece of information is the key to the preceding conversation. Now, it had so happened that, in approaching the door, Eliza had caught enough of the conversation to know that a trader was making offers to her master for somebody. She would gladly have stopped at the door to listen, as she came out, but her mistress just then calling, she was obliged to hasten away. Still she thought she heard the trader make an offer for her boy. Could she be mistaken? Her heart swelled and throbbed, and she involuntarily strained him so tight that the little fellow looked up into her face in astonishment. "Eliza, girl, what ails you today?" said her mistress, when Eliza had upset the wash pitcher, knocked down the workstand, and finally was abstracted offering her mistress a long nightgown in place of the silk dress she had ordered her to bring from the wardrobe. Eliza started. "Oh, Mrs.," she said, raising her eyes, then, bursting into tears, she sat down in a chair, and began sobbing. "Why, Eliza, child, what ails you?" said her mistress. "Oh, Mrs., said Eliza, "there's been a trader talking with master in the parlor. I heard him." "Well, silly child, suppose there has." "Oh, Mrs., do you suppose masser would sell my Harry?" And the poor creature threw herself into a chair, and sobbed convulsively. "Sell him? No, you foolish girl. You know your master never deals with those southern traders, and never means to sell any of his servants, as long as they behave well. Why, you silly child, who do you think would want to buy your Harry? Do you think all the world are set on him as you are? You goosey? Come, cheer up, and hook my dress. There now, put my back hair up in that pretty braid you learnt the other day. And don't go listening at doors any more. Well, but, Mrs., you never would give your consent to. Nonsense, child, to be sure, I shouldn't. What do you talk so for? I would as soon have one of my own children sold. But really, Eliza, you are getting altogether too proud of that little fellow. A man can't put his nose into the door, but you think he must be coming to buy him." Reassured by her mistress' confident tone, Eliza proceeded nimbly and adroitly with her toilet, laughing at her own fears. As she proceeded, Mrs. Shelby was a woman of a high class, both intellectually and morally, to that natural magnanimity and generosity of mind which one often marks as characteristic of the women of Kentucky. She added high moral and religious sensibility and principle, carried out with great energy and ability into practical results. Her husband, who made no professions to any particular religious character, nevertheless reverenced and respected the consistency of hers, and stood, perhaps, a little in awe of her opinion. Certain it was that he gave her unlimited scope in all her benevolent efforts for the comfort, instruction, and improvement of her servants, though he never took any decided part in them himself. In fact, if not exactly a believer in the doctrine of the efficiency of the extra good works of saints, he really seemed somehow or other to fancy that his wife had piety and benevolence enough for two, to indulge a shadowy expectation of getting into heaven through her superabundance of qualities to which he made no particular pretension. The heaviest load on his mind, after his conversation with the trader, lay in the foreseen necessity of breaking to his wife the arrangement contemplated, meeting the importunities and opposition which he knew he should have reason to encounter. Mrs. Shelby, being entirely ignorant of her husband's embarrassments, and knowing only the general kindliness of his temper, had been quite sincere in the entire incredulity with which she had met Eliza's suspicions. In fact, she dismissed the matter from her mind, without a second thought, and being occupied in preparations for an evening visit, it passed out of her thoughts entirely. Chapter 2. The Mother. Eliza had been brought up by her mistress, from girlhood, as a petted and indulged favorite. The traveler in the South must often have remarked that peculiar air of refinement, that softness of voice and manner, which seems in many cases to be a particular gift to the quadroon and mulatto women. These natural graces in the quadroon are often united with beauty of the most dazzling kind, and in almost every case with a personal appearance prepossessing and agreeable. Eliza, such as we have described her, is not a fancy sketch, but taken from remembrance, as we saw her, years ago, in Kentucky, safe under the protecting care of her mistress. Eliza had reached maturity without those temptations which make beauty so fatal an inheritance to a slave. She had been married to a bright and talented young mulatto man, who was a slave on a neighboring estate, and bore the name of George Harris. This young man had been hired out by his master to work in a bagging factory, where his adroitness and ingenuity caused him to be considered the first hand in the place. He had invented a machine for the cleaning of the hemp, which, considering the education and circumstances of the inventor, displayed quite as much mechanical genius as Whitney's cotton gin. He was possessed of a handsome person and pleasing manners, and was a general favorite in the factory. Nevertheless, as this young man was in the eye of the law not a man, but a thing, all these superior qualifications were subject to the control of a vulgar, narrow-minded, tyrannical master. This same gentleman, having heard of the fame of George's invention, took a ride over to the factory, to see what this intelligent chattel had been about. He was received with great enthusiasm by the employer, who congratulated him on possessing so valuable a slave. He was waited upon over the factory, shown the machinery by George, who, in high spirits, talked so fluently, held himself so erect, looked so handsome and manly, that his master began to feel an uneasy consciousness of inferiority. What business had his slave to be marching round the country, inventing machines, and holding up his head among gentlemen? He'd soon put a stop to it. He'd take him back, and put him to hoeing and digging, and see if he'd step about so smart. Accordingly, the manufacturer and all hands concerned were astounded when he suddenly demanded George's wages, and announced his intention of taking him home. "But, Mr. Harris," remonstrated the manufacturer, "isn't this rather sudden? What if it is? Isn't the man mine? We would be willing, sir, to increase the rate of compensation. No object at all, sir. I don't need to hire any of my hands out, unless I've a mind to. But, sir, he seems peculiarly adapted to this business. Dare say he may be, never was much adapted to anything that I set him about. I'll be bound. But only think of his inventing this machine," interposed one of the workmen, rather unluckily. "Oh yes, a machine for saving work. Is it? He'd invent that. I'll be bound. Let a nigger alone for that. Any time. They are all labor-saving machines themselves. Every one of 'em. No, he shall tramp." George had stood like one transfixed, at hearing his doom thus suddenly pronounced by a power that he knew was irresistible. He folded his arms, tightly pressed in his lips, but a whole volcano of bitter feelings burned in his bosom, and sent streams of fire through his veins. He breathed short, and his large dark eyes flashed like live coals, and he might have broken out into some dangerous ebullition, had not the kindly manufacturer touched him on the arm, and said, in a low tone, "Give way, George, go with him for the present. We'll try to help you." Yet, the tyrant observed the whisper, and conjectured its import, though he could not hear what was said, and he inwardly strengthened himself in his determination to keep the power he possessed over his victim. George was taken home, and put to the meanest drudgery of the farm. He had been able to repress every disrespectful word, but the flashing eye, the gloomy and troubled brow, were part of a natural language that could not be repressed, indubitable signs, which showed too plainly that the man could not become a thing. It was during the happy period of his employment in the factory that George had seen and married his wife. During that period, being much trusted and favored by his employer, he had free liberty to come and go at discretion. The marriage was highly approved of by Mrs. Shelby, who, with a little womanly complacency in matchmaking, felt pleased to unite her handsome favorite with one of her own class who seemed in every way suited to her, and so they were married in her mistress' great parlor. And her mistress herself adorned the bride's beautiful hair with orange blossoms, and threw over it the bridal veil, which certainly could scarce have rested on a fairer head, and there was no lack of white gloves, and cake and wine, of admiring guests to praise the bride's beauty, and her mistress' indulgence and liberality. For a year or two Eliza saw her husband frequently, and there was nothing to interrupt their happiness, except the loss of 2 infant children, to whom she was passionately attached, and whom she mourned with a grief so intense as to call for gentle remonstrance from her mistress, who sought, with maternal anxiety, to direct her naturally passionate feelings within the bounds of reason and religion. After the birth of little Harry, however, she had gradually become tranquilized and settled, and every bleeding tie and throbbing nerve, once more entwined with that little life, seemed to become sound and healthful. And Eliza was a happy woman up to the time that her husband was rudely torn from his kind employer, and brought under the iron sway of his legal owner. The manufacturer, true to his word, visited Mr. Harris a week or 2 after George had been taken away, when, as he hoped, the heat of the occasion had passed away, and tried every possible inducement to lead him to restore him to his former employment. "You needn't trouble yourself to talk any longer," said he, doggedly. "I know my own business. Sir, I did not presume to interfere with it. Sir, I only thought that you might think it for your interest to let your man to us on the terms proposed. Oh, I understand the matter well enough. I saw your winking and whispering the day I took him out of the factory, but you don't come it over me that way. It's a free country, sir, the man's mine, and I do what I please with him, that's it." And so fell George's last hope, nothing before him but a life of toil and drudgery, rendered more bitter by every little smarting vexation and indignity which tyrannical ingenuity could devise. A very humane jurist once said, "The worst use you can put a man to is to hang him." No, there is another use that a man can be put to that is worse. Chapter 3. The Husband and Father. Mrs. Shelby had gone on her visit, and Eliza stood in the veranda, rather dejectedly looking after the retreating carriage, when a hand was laid on her shoulder. She turned, and a bright smile lighted up her fine eyes. "George, is it you? How you frightened me. Well, I am so glad you,'s come. Mrs. is gone to spend the afternoon, so come into my little room, and we'll have the time all to ourselves." Saying this, she drew him into a neat little apartment opening on the veranda, where she generally sat at her sewing, within call of her mistress. "How glad I am. Why don't you smile, and look at Harry, how he grows?" The boy stood shyly regarding his father through his curls, holding close to the skirts of his mother's dress. "Isn't he beautiful?" said Eliza, lifting his long curls and kissing him. "I wish he'd never been born," said George, bitterly. "I wish I'd never been born myself." Surprised and frightened, Eliza sat down, leaned her head on her husband's shoulder, and burst into tears. "There now, Eliza, it's too bad for me to make you feel so." "Poor girl," said he, fondly, "it's too bad. Oh, how I wish you never had seen me, you might have been happy." "George, George, how can you talk so? What dreadful thing has happened? Or is going to happen? I'm sure we've been very happy, till lately." "So we have, dear," said George. Then drawing his child on his knee, he gazed intently on his glorious dark eyes, and passed his hands through his long curls. "Just like you, Eliza, and you are the handsomest woman I ever saw, and the best one I ever wish to see, but, oh, I wish I'd never seen you, nor you me. Oh George, how can you?" "Yes, Eliza, it's all misery, misery, misery. My life is bitter as wormwood, the very life is burning out of me. I'm a poor, miserable, forlorn drudge. I shall only drag you down with me. That's all. What's the use of our trying to do anything? Trying to know anything? Trying to be anything? What's the use of living? I wish I was dead." "Oh now, dear George, that is really wicked. I know how you feel about losing your place in the factory. And you have a hard master, but pray be patient. And perhaps something—" "Patient," said he, interrupting her. "Haven't I been patient? Did I say a word when he came and took me away? For no earthly reason, from the place where everybody was kind to me? I'd paid him truly every cent of my earnings, and they all say I worked well." "Well, it is dreadful," said Eliza, "but, after all, he is your master, you know, my master. And who made him my master? That's what I think of. What right has he to me? I'm a man as much as he is. I'm a better man than he is. I know more about business than he does. I am a better manager than he is. I can read better than he can. I can write a better hand, and I've learned it all myself. And no thanks to him, I've learned it in spite of him, and now what right has he to make a dray horse of me, to take me from things I can do, and do better than he can, and put me to work that any horse can do? He tries to do it, he says he'll bring me down and humble me. And he puts me to just the hardest, meanest and dirtiest work, on purpose. Oh George, George, you frighten me. Why, I never heard you talk so. I'm afraid you'll do something dreadful. I don't wonder at your feelings. At all, but oh, do be careful, do. Do, for my sake, for Harry's. I have been careful, and I have been patient. But it's growing worse and worse. Flesh and blood can't bear it any longer. Every chance he can get to insult and torment me, he takes. I thought I could do my work well, and keep on quiet, and have some time to read and learn out of work hours, but the more he sees I can do, the more he loads on. He says that though I don't say anything, he sees I've got the devil in me, and he means to bring it out, and one of these days it will come out in a way that he won't like. Or I'm mistaken. Oh dear, what shall we do? Said Eliza, mournfully. It was only yesterday, said George, as I was busy loading stones into a cart, that young Mas'r Tom stood there, slashing his whip so near the horse that the creature was frightened. I asked him to stop. As pleasant as I could, he just kept right on. I begged him again, and then he turned on me, and began striking me. I held his hand, and then he screamed and kicked and ran to his father, and told him that I was fighting him. He came in a rage, and said he'd teach me who was my master, and he tied me to a tree, and cut switches for young master, and told him that he might whip me till he was tired, and he did do it, if I don't make him remember it, sometime. And the brow of the young man grew dark, and his eyes burned with an expression that made his young wife tremble. Who made this man my master? That's what I want to know, he said. Well, said Eliza, mournfully, I always thought that I must obey my master and mistress, or I couldn't be a Christian. There is some sense in it. In your case, they have brought you up like a child, fed you, clothed you, indulged you, and taught you, so that you have a good education. That is some reason why they should claim you. But I have been kicked and cuffed and sworn at, and at the best only let alone, and what do I owe? I've paid for all my keeping 100 times over. I won't bear it. No, I won't, he said, clenching his hand with a fierce frown. Eliza trembled, and was silent. She had never seen her husband in this mood before, and her gentle system of ethics seemed to bend like a reed in the surges of such passions. You know poor little Carlo, that you gave me, added George. The creature has been about all the comfort that I've had. He has slept with me nights, and followed me around days, and kind-o looked at me as if he understood how I felt. Well, the other day I was just feeding him with a few old scraps I picked up by the kitchen door, and Mas'r came along, and said I was feeding him up at his expense, and that he couldn't afford to have every nigger keeping his dog, and ordered me to tie a stone to his neck and throw him in the pond. Oh George, you didn't do it. Do it? Not I, but he did. Mas'r and Tom pelted the poor drowning creature with stones. Poor thing, he looked at me so mournful, as if he wondered why I didn't save him. I had to take a flogging because I wouldn't do it myself. I don't care. Mas'r will find out that I'm one that whipping won't tame. My day will come yet, if he don't look out. What are you going to do? Oh, George, don't do anything wicked, if you only trust in God, and try to do right. He'll deliver you. I ain't a Christian like you. Eliza, my heart's full of bitterness. I can't trust in God. Why does he let things be so? Oh George, we must have faith. Mistress says that when all things go wrong to us, we must believe that God is doing the very best. That's easy to say for people that are sitting on their sofas and riding in their carriages, but let him be where I am. I guess it would come some harder. I wish I could be good, but my heart burns, and can't be reconciled. Anyhow, you couldn't in my place, you can't now. If I tell you all I've got to say, you don't know the whole yet. What can be coming now? Well, lately Mas'r has been saying that he was a fool to let me marry off the place, that he hates Mr. Shelby and all his tribe, because they are proud, and hold their heads up above him, And that I've got proud notions from you, and he says he won't let me come here any more. And that I shall take a wife and settle down on his place. At first he only scolded and grumbled these things, but yesterday he told me that I should take Nina for a wife. And settle down in a cabin with her, or he would sell me down river. Why, but you were married to me, by the minister. As much as if you'd been a white man, said Eliza. Simply, don't you know a slave can't be married? There is no law in this country for that. I can't hold you for my wife. If he chooses to part us. That's why I wish I'd never seen you, why I wish I'd never been born. It would have been better for us both. It would have been better for this poor child if he had never been born. All this may happen to him yet. Oh, but master is so kind. Yes, but who knows, he may die, and then he may be sold to nobody knows who. What pleasure is it that he is handsome, and smart, and bright? I tell you, Eliza, that a sword will pierce through your soul for every good and pleasant thing your child is or has. It will make him worth too much for you to keep. The words smote heavily on Eliza's heart. The vision of the traitor came before her eyes. And, as if someone had struck her a deadly blow, she turned pale and gasped for breath. She looked nervously out on the veranda, where the boy, tired of the grave conversation, had retired, and where he was riding triumphantly up and down on Mr. Shelby's walking stick. She would have spoken to tell her husband her fears, but checked herself. No, no, he has enough to bear. Poor fellow, she thought. No, I won't tell him. Besides, it ain't true, Mrs. never deceives us. So, Eliza, my girl, said the husband, mournfully, bear up, now, and goodbye. For I'm going. Going, George. Going where? To Canada, said he, straightening himself up, and when I'm there, I'll buy you. That's all the hope that's left us. You have a kind master that won't refuse to sell you. I'll buy you and the boy, God helping me. I will. Oh, dreadful. If you should be taken? I won't be taken, Eliza. I'll die first. I'll be free, or I'll die. You won't kill yourself. No need of that. They will kill me, fast enough. They never will get me down the river alive. Oh, George, for my sake, do be careful. Don't do anything wicked. Don't lay hands on yourself. Or anybody else. You are tempted too much, but don't. Go you must, but go carefully. Prudently, pray God to help you. Well, then, Eliza, hear my plan. Masser took it into his head to send me right by here. With a note to Mr. Sims. That lives a mile past. I believe he expected I should come here to tell you what I have. It would please him, if he thought it would aggravate Shelby's folks, as he calls them. I'm going home quite resigned. You understand, as if all was over. I've got some preparations made, and there are those that will help me, and in the course of a week or so, I shall be among the missing. Some day, pray for me, Eliza, perhaps the good Lord will hear you. Oh, pray yourself, George, and go trusting in him, then you won't do anything wicked. Well, now, goodbye, said George, holding Eliza's hands, and gazing into her eyes. Without moving, they stood silent. Then there were last words, and sobs, and bitter weeping. Such parting as those may make whose hope to meet again is as the spider's web. And the husband and wife were parted.